Hey there, and welcome to episode 78 of your fun and profitable online business. This is the podcast that helps you build a business that feels as good as it looks. I'm Woody Muzzy, and I help women entrepreneurs create fun and profitable businesses by reducing friction, making better decisions, and building systems that actually work with the way they think. Last week, we talked about becoming a better business detective. Instead of jumping straight into fixing every problem, we practice slowing down and collecting evidence. Today, I want to turn that detective work inward, because one of the biggest sources of business data isn't your analytics dashboard. It isn't your email open rates. It's none of that. It's you. It's your thoughts, your emotions, and your behaviors. They're all leaving clues with you every single day. The problem is that most of us skip right past those clues and head straight to the judgment zone. I'm lazy, or I'm not good at this. But what if those weren't conclusions? What if they were simply stories you've been telling yourself before you've gathered all the evidence? Today, we're going to look at how becoming curious about yourself can change the way you solve problems in your business. All right, let's get to it. One of the things that I love most about my background in research is that researchers aren't trying to prove themselves right. They're trying to discover what's true, and that's a very different perspective. I laugh at the thought of imagining a scientist walking into a lab, and she starts with the conclusion and says, well, I already know what happened. We're all done here. No, that never happens. She starts by observing. She asks questions, and she gathers information. Then, and only then, does she begin to start forming conclusions. But we sometimes miss this as entrepreneurs. And sometimes we actually do the exact opposite. Something doesn't go the way we hoped. Within seconds, we've already diagnosed ourselves as the problem because our brains are incredibly good at creating explanations. The problem is those explanations aren't always accurate. They're often just our first thought. And first thoughts make terrible long-term business strategies. One of the most helpful lessons I've ever learned comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It's the idea that our thoughts influence our emotions, and our emotions influence our behaviors, and those behaviors create our results. Sometimes we only pay attention to that last part, the results part. We notice a launch that didn't go well or something. But we rarely pause long enough to ask ourselves what happened before that. Because every result has a trail of clues leading up to it every single time. And if you can learn to notice those clues, you'll spend a lot less time spinning around the wrong problem. All right, let's talk about the 3 places to look for clues. Number 1, your thoughts. Let me start by saying every thought is not true. But every thought is information. Here are some of the thoughts that I hear repeated in my high-achieving entrepreneur clients. I'm behind. I'm not ready. I should know this already. I just don't follow through. I've missed my chance. Not a single one of these are facts. They're all interpretations. And here's where it gets interesting. If any of these hit too close to home, I challenge you to try observing the thought instead of arguing with it. When does it show up? What happened right before it appeared? Does it happen when you're working on something specific? Does it happen whenever you're looking at someone else's Instagram? Maybe when you're opening a file? Your thoughts are not instructions. They're just clues. And sometimes simply noticing that thought keeps appearing is enough to start to loosen its grip. So instead of saying, this is definitely true, you begin by saying, that's interesting. Now you've gathered data, and data is far more useful than criticism will ever be. Spot number 2 to look, your emotions. I think your emotions in general, get a bad reputation out there. We often treat them like problems we need to solve instead of information to help us understand. I like to think of them as lights on your dashboard, like whenever you're driving. Now, I have not had a light come on my dashboard in a very long time, But if I did, I wouldn't just cover it up with a sticky note or pretend like everything's fine. I also wouldn't panic and assume there's a fire under the hood. I'd get curious about what that specific light is a warning for. I'd look through my owner's manual. I'd notice it and I'd really start to be curious about it. The same thing is true for business. Whenever your emotions show up like fear or excitement or relief or curiosity or jealousy or avoidance, they're all pointing to something. Sometimes fear shows up when you're about to do something important or new. Sometimes jealousy reveals something you secretly want for yourself. And sometimes relief tells you that you've finally removed a source of friction. The goal here isn't to eliminate emotions. The goal is to observe and then understand them. Because when you understand what's underneath that feeling, you can make much better decisions. All right, spot number 3 to observe, your behaviors. This might be the most honest data you'll ever collect because behaviors, I like to think of them as our lie detector test. You can tell yourself that creating content is your number one top priority, but if you've reorganized your Canva folder 3 times this week instead of writing a post, that's data. You can tell yourself that networking is really incredibly important to you, but if you've declined every opportunity to connect with people, that's data. There's no judgment here. It's just evidence. Your calendar tells a story. Your task list tells a story. The projects you finished tell a story. And the ones you've been avoiding for 6 months, those tell a story too. The question here isn't what's wrong with you. The question is, what are you noticing here? Let me give you one of my favorite examples. Let's say someone tells me, I hate creating content. Maybe they do. But I also get curious, maybe they don't. Maybe recording takes 15 minutes to set up every single time, or they never know what to talk about, or editing feels incredibly overwhelming, or they're trying to post on 5 different platforms. Maybe they don't actually hate creating content. Maybe they hate all the friction surrounding creating content. Those are very different problems, and each one has a completely different solution. And this is why observation matters. Because if you solve the wrong problem, you're going to stay stuck. But when you identify the real source of friction, progress starts feeling incredibly easy. Here's something I've noticed over the years. Most of us are incredibly compassionate towards everyone else. If your business friend came to you and said she kept putting something off, I hope you wouldn't say, wow, gosh, you're so lazy. Instead, you'd ask questions. You'd want to understand. You'd get curious with her. But when it's you, I bet you skip the curiosity and go straight to judgment. You assume that you're the problem. What if this week you gave yourself the same grace you'd offer someone else you cared about? Because curiosity creates awareness. Awareness creates better decisions, and better decisions create businesses that feel lighter, feel simpler, and are a whole lot more fun to run. Trust me on that. All right, let's get to your action step for this week. For the next 7 days, I want you to become a researcher of your own business. Each time you catch yourself making a judgment, pause, and then turn that into an observation instead. Here are some examples. Instead of, I'm procrastinating again, try, I've opened this document 4 times today and closed it without writing. Or, instead of, I'm terrible at selling, try, I've only mentioned my offer once this month. Here we want to collect facts first and create stories later. Your goal this week isn't to fix anything. It's simply to collect evidence, because once you know what's actually happening, you'll be in a much, much better position to improve it. All right, let's wrap up. Today wasn't about changing your thoughts or forcing yourself to feel differently or suddenly becoming perfectly productive. It's about noticing your thoughts, noticing your emotions, and noticing your behaviors, because they're all leaving you clues. And when you learn to observe those clues with curiosity instead of criticism, you'll start making decisions based on evidence instead of assumptions. And that's where real change begins. All right, if you've enjoyed this conversation, I'd love for you to join us at the next CEO Hour. You can grab your free spot at wendymuzzy.com/CEO. And if this episode made you think of another business owner who could use a little bit more curiosity, and maybe a little less self-criticism, I'd love for you to send it their way. Until next time, happy building your fun and profitable online business.